All right, coming at you with part 2 of the introduction to the modernist period. Some modern poets retained the formal toolkit of their inheritance while pushing back hard against thematic conventions. One good example from our list is Siegfried Sassoon's poem, The Glory of Women, which leverages the conventional powers of a sonnet. You missed it, didn't you? It's a sonnet. Go back and look. It leverages the conventional powers of a sonnet, especially the sonnet's protective containment, to which many previous poets had turned for a safe arena in which to explore big, unwieldy themes. Here, however, Sassoon replaces the more typical subject matter of a sonnet, love, faith, the sublime in nature, valiant battles with the pain of loss or the inevitability of death. He replaces those, or at least gives them a really hard turn, a bit of a wrench, so that his subject matter is this tightly corseted personal cynicism and resentment about the relationship that he has with women back home, or his feelings about the way women back home think of and speak of and behave towards soldiers. This is the, as I said, the corseted cynicism and resentment of his perspective as a soldier. And also his inner conflict about even having those feelings following his experience in World War I. Obviously, this was not the first time that themes of anger or grief had been presented in poetry, never mind in the sonnet. But modernists really shook the world, I think, with their willingness to present these emotions raw and unresolved. For another good example in this vein, you might look at the modern sonnets of Edna St. Vincent Malay. One of the things I love about Malay's work, and something that I think makes it perhaps particularly modern, is that it is expressly and fiercely inconsolable. Malay refuses to be pawned off by anybody on platitudes or cheap comfort for the earth-shattering losses of her life, which she knows are not only her own losses either. And I think maybe that's part of why she won't be pawned off on cheap comfort, because she's insisting that the scale of injury be recognized, the irreparable quality of it. Think of her title, Time Does Not Bring Relief, You All Have Lied. Or the refrain in her poem, Dirge Without Music. Those 4 little words, I am not resigned, which basically means I do not accept. I might acknowledge, but I do not accept. In some ways, poetry and its general trends had never been so consistently bleak or argumentative as it was at the height of modernism. And it wasn't just poetry either, where this existential crisis of bereavement and of trauma was playing out. It showed up everywhere. It showed up in fiction. I think you'll see it particularly keenly in our scheduled short story by Ernest Hemingway, titled A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. I'm just so excited. Every time I mention a title, I'm just like, oh, that's a really good one. I'm very excited for the works that we're going to be working through in this unit. I probably say that every time because I love this stuff, but you've got good things coming to you. So, these were all folks who rebelled through tone and content, perhaps more than form. Not that they didn't innovate with forms, but at least with the people we've discussed, tone and content were probably the more noticeable areas for kickback and experimentation. Other modernist poets challenged the formal toolkit itself. Stanza form, rhyme schemes, metrical rules, page layout, margins, things like spelling conventions and physical alignment on the page. To the modernists, all of this was fair game to be radically screwed with or thrown out altogether. Where modernists saw previous art history as being dominant by repetitive debates about how poetry should be beautiful, about how much and in what ways language might best be decorated, modernists rebelled through minimalism, This was how they went, like, nope, forget that, we're going the other way. Forget about direct decoration, they said. Get to the point, get to the core, get to the most economic, raw, real, unfiltered, unfiligreed picture of things. Almost all of the Canadian poets on our course this week, F.R. Scott, P.K. Page, Margaret Atwood, demonstrate a level of this modernist minimalism, albeit each in their own ways and often paired with other key modernist trends or themes. William Butler Yeats' poem, A Coat, which we also looked at this week, that poem narrates perhaps a different motivation for modernists' abandonment of the high decoration of previous eras, in that it expresses a feeling that such decorative representations of thought and feeling are too easily co-opted purely for their aesthetic interest and sort of hollowed out of their intended inner depth and meaning. I made my song a coat, he says, this is Yeats, covered with embroideries out of old mythologies from heel to throat. Think back to the poems of his that we read last term in the Victorian period, The Cloths of Heaven, The Stolen Child, others. That pretty much fits, right? I made my song a coat covered with embroideries out of old mythologies from heel to throat. But the fools caught it, wore it in the world's eyes as though they'd wrought it. Song, let them take it, for there's more enterprise in walking naked. This is a really important poem in terms of the way it narrates a moment, a shift in thinking, not just for Yeats, but for others. I think there's more to Yeats' thinking here than just a frustration with his poems being valued too much for their beauty and not enough for their substance. I think his poem also expresses the general modernist feeling that high embellishment strikes the wrong tone for a time and place where everyone, everything, and every thought has just about been bombed into oblivion. So in a major turn that would mark a tipping point for his career, Yeats says here that nakedness, starkness, becomes more appropriate. Going forward, for Yeats, it will be about leaning into raw concept, the untranslated expression of pure ideas, which you'll see reflected in his post-war poem, The Second Coming, which is a bit almost Delphian, a bit visionary. His line in that poem, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold," became one of the defining lines of this period, a hallmark expression of the impact of the world wars. And when I used that phrase a moment ago, when I say the untranslated expression of pure ideas, I want to lay emphasis on untranslated. By the mid-20th century, the accumulated trauma of not one but two global conflicts, technologically advanced global conflicts, millions of deaths. This accumulated trauma had so gutted Western people's faith in any kind of governing meaning in the world whatsoever, never mind the existence of a god, that many artists deliberately and demonstratively gave up trying to make their work comprehensible at all. While many artists continued, as I said earlier, to try and write work that would both reflect the new shape of reality and point to a way forward, those would be your capital R realists, others decided that all their work really needed to do was reflect the true and bottomless absurdity of life, the gaping, cavernous, cosmic meaninglessness of it all, and the attendant ironies of human activity. So here, once again, out of deference to the fact that our syllabus does very minimal justice to the theater side of things, I refer you to another excellent crash course video on theater of the absurd. It's an important movement to know about, but the actual texts are a bit advanced for our course. I'll explain more about the logic behind the text choices for drama in this week, for drama week in this unit as I've chosen them. Talk more about that down the road. But for now, click on over to the second link in the description of this YouTube video. Well, we're in a separate YouTube video. click on the link in the description of this YouTube video. Yes, for a little brief on theater of the absurd. I promise it'll help you make much better sense of some of the poetry readings on our course and the role of absurdity in modernist thinking overall. So you can skip note from 334 to 712, everything on Jean Genet. You don't need to know. Go ahead. I'll wait. Okay, so those are some of the ways that modernists rebelled artistically in order to serve their time and place through different kinds of starkness, nakedness, and minimalism. But there were also, on the other hand, modern artists rebelling in completely different ways or directions. Rather than being chiefly too elaborate, some modernists felt that art up to this point had been chiefly too tidy, too structured, too much like a well-tuned instrument. So they rebelled against that pretty containment by running on at extraordinary length or heaping up repetitions. In some cases, especially further into the modernist period, these long, unspooling, repetitive experimentations were used to emulate the ruminative, perseverating tendencies of the traumatized mind, or to underline the inane, almost alien sound of peacetime small talk after the roar and extremity of war. I direct you, for one example, back to Almond Blossom by D.H. Lawrence, who makes ample use of anaphora or poetic repetition. If you are very brave, you might also look at T.S. Eliot's poem The Hollow Men, which is where we get the classic line that you might have heard before: "This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends," not with a bang, but a whimper. Alternately, if you are very, very brave, if you want an example of what this sort of maximalist trend looked at its most intense, where the poetics of maximalism collided with those thematic preoccupations of absurdism that we just talked about, right at the height of the modernist period, then I refer you to T.S. Eliot's other poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is one of my favorite modernist poems ever, but does demand a high tolerance for the borderline incomprehensible. It is very, very long and very, very weird, and to my perception, totally delightful. But there's all the sort of extra credit material. Got about 2 minutes left here. Pushing a bit more into the realm of fiction for just a moment. At the beginning of this video, I talked about how Irish artists pioneered a key modernist technique called stream of consciousness. Here we come back around to that point. In both poetry and fiction, there were key modernist figures pioneering a new style out of these techniques that I just spoke about, so the repetition and the sort of long unspooling shapes or styles. This new technique called stream of consciousness, sought to reproduce on paper the exact shape and pattern of a person's actual thinking. In fiction, the most notable stream of consciousness writer was the Irish author James Joyce, followed closely by the American William Faulkner, at least in some, not all of his works. Our short story by Faulkner is not particularly stream of consciousness, but some of his novels were. You will see this technique, or a version of it, on our course through the short story The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Gilman. Gilman was a very early exemplar, and refreshingly a female exemplar, of stream of consciousness style, particularly as applied to portray the psychological effects of trauma. In her case, a very feminist kind of trauma. Whew! We did it, you guys! That is it for your large-scale introduction to modernism. Coming up next, you're looking for Modernist Poetry Selections Unpacked, where I'll spend a bit more time analyzing some key poems that didn't get as much attention in the course of this video as we might need them to. Stay tuned.